branches. Joint Task Force Bravo has been in Sotocano, Honduras, on Honduran base since the mid-1980s, sort of a leftover from the bad old days. Key West, this is the premier drug detection and monitoring office in the United States, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And at Guantanamo, we are responsible for the detention of those terrorists, those now about 160, 170 people that are detained. We do not manage the naval station, which has been there, of course, now for more than 100 years. But we do have several hundred enlisted folks who are the jailers for those detainees. If you ever get a visit to visit Guantanamo, do it. I know a lot of folks from human rights organizations and the media have been there. It is not what you probably have in your mind's eye. It's a fascinating place and very, very interesting. When we think about the region, and we think about really how diverse it is, and a lot of gringos, if you will, kind of really don't understand this. When they think about Latin America, they think, well, yeah, there's a lot of countries down there, but they sort of all speak Spanish. They're all very similar. They're all kind of the same. Our policy must be the same. And really, that's not quite true. For no other reason, let's see, we've got 200 million now Portuguese speakers. Of course, English and Dutch and French and Creole spoken in the Caribbean. I don't know, dozen or so major indigenous language groups and hundreds of dialects. So it really is a very diverse region. Also, I think people need to think about those economic linkages between the United States and Latin America. 10 of our 17 free trade agreements are with nations in that region. 40% of U.S. trade is north and south. That's more than to Europe. That's more than to Asia. Panama Canal, still a vital hub, and in fact, Panama is now expanding that canal. More than $40 billion in remittances sent back from folks from those nations that live and work in the United States, and those cultural linkages. This number, U.S. is now the 5th largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. If you make a reasonable estimate of how many undocumented folks there are in the United States that speak Spanish, we're number 2. So, we have become, in many ways, a Latin nation. And indeed, you take a look at this map, and the darker blue, the greater the Hispanic population. But in fact, you're at a point where there are some states that are now more than 40% Latino. These were the 10 largest cities in the United States 100 years ago. 7 of those cities have shifted, if you will, to our southwest border, and they have such names as San Antonio. Phoenix's actual name is La Mesa. Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco. And these are the most common surnames in the United States. First 7 or so you might guess, given our Anglo-Saxon roots, but you get down pretty rapidly. You get to Garcia, Rodriguez, Martinez, Hernandez. The next one happens to be Gonzalez. So, and our the demographic people tell us that by the middle of the century, a quarter to a third of the U.S. population will have Latin roots. And in fact, there's really has been, from our point of view, kind of a fusing of sort of gringo culture with Hispanic culture in many ways, whether it's in the movies and song. I used to have a picture of Shakira there, but the women in the command unit put that guy up. I don't know who that is, but it's somebody important. Of course, greater sort of political visibility and power of Latinos in the United States, Sonia Sotomayor from the Supreme Court. The fact that even in media, Univision, of course, headquartered right down the street, now, and by some measures, is the 3rd largest broadcast network in the United States. Globo TV from Brazil is the 4th largest in the world. And of course, when you think about those linkages, and one thing I've certainly seen in my career is the growth of the Latin Hispanic populations in the United States, their rise up the political ladder, means that there's more and more interplay between sort of U.S. domestic politics and U.S. foreign policy related to Latin America. Let's think about now how we look at security concerns in the in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it really is much more than kind of that traditional balance of forces issue. You know, this is sort of the roller coaster of democracy in Latin America, you know, which has moved from, you know, at least nominal democracies, functioning democracies in the 50s, down towards largely, call them dictatorships, but military governments of one stripe or another by the late 70s, back up to the high water mark, if you will, of era in the late 90s of every country in Latin America being reasonably democratic, of course, with the exception of Cuba, and in fact the real high watermark being the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter in 2001, and then some backsliding, quite frankly, and we could talk more about that. We've named these countries in ALBA fragile democracies. You can make up other names, but in fact there's been sort of a real challenge. You all know this is what you do as part of this group, but a real challenge to kind of traditional democratic notions in at least these countries. There's also this kind of backdrop when you think about the challenges and you think about national security in its largest sense. Latin America is still a poor place, even though there's been some improvements in poverty levels in the last decade in many countries. Still 1 out of 3 people in Latin America live in poverty. That's $2 a day by UN standards, about 1 in 8 in extreme poverty, $1 a day. Latin America is more, the wealth is more unequally distributed than any other large region in the world, worse than Africa even. And, you know, whether you believe those numbers or not, we all know that this is true, that there are classes of folks in Latin America who really are excluded from the system, and that can be based on race and ethnicity and indigenousness. But we know that that's true. And in fact, you know, there are parts of Latin American populations that really don't have a lot of stake in the system, don't have all the opportunity perhaps they should have. And that's something that people play on. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we have those fragile democracies today. And then corruption. This, I think, is obvious to people. It's something we really didn't talk about very much till about a decade ago. This is actually a corruption map. This is the Transparency International Index, and the bluer you are, the more corrupt you are, if you will, as far as TI is concerned. Of course, governments hate every year when this comes out, right? I mean, it just drives them crazy, and they say, well, that's just perception, that's not real. How do you measure it? And okay, but, you know, when I talk to people, I say, hey, you know, these perceptions do have real-world implications. I mean, look at Haiti. You know, for truth or false, you know, there are perceived to be a corrupt government, and that has really impacted on reconstruction. I mean, the willingness of donors to hand over sort of cash and liquid resources to the Haitian government, you know, very limited right now because of that kind of perception. My boss thinks, and I think he's absolutely right, really the greatest challenge is illicit trafficking. No, and it's not only drugs, it's arms, it's human trafficking, it's money laundering, it's exotic animals, it's all that stuff. They all use sort of the same networks. Sort of a corollary to that, narco-terrorism. You know, the FARC and others are still, you know, alive. Crime in urban gangs, which is really intended to narco-terrorism. And if you use, you know, a lot of talk about crime in Latin America, but I mean, if you use the murder rate as kind of a proxy for crime, you know, the murder rate in Western Europe is about 1 in 100,000 a year. United States, which is a fairly violent developed country, it's 5. Latin America in general, in average, is 25. We're at the point now where Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are in that 40 to 50 range. And there are places in Latin America, Caracas, northern Mexico, Ciudad Juarez is well up over 100. And we also look at transnational terrorism. I mean, you know, we're not there yet, really there, but the pathways could be there, and it's something as as a combatant command, you can imagine we're concerned about. And we're always concerned about these